Hi and welcome to Ethics 201, Business Ethics and Corporate Social Responsibility, Lecture 11A. Lecture 11A in week 12. It's called Putting It All Together, not because I'm going to go through a whole course summary. This is more about linking the things we've discussed over the course to your professional careers. In Lecture 11B, I will be talking about other aspects of the course. I'll be going through some of the key theoretical areas within the course and talking about the structure and content of the exam. Then next week, we have a session, online session. It's going to be completely in Zoom. It's an interactive session over 3 hours. And in that interactive session over 3 hours, there'll be some practice quizzes and some discussion about some of the sample questions for the exam. So here goes. Topic 11A, putting it all together. What are our objectives? Well, the objectives draw from the textbook, which is the source of the slides, but I've adapted them. Our objectives from this session are that on successful completion, students should be able to understand how self-interest can conflict with our moral obligations, understand the role and limitations of regulations in affecting ethical behaviour, understand the benefits of ethical leadership and living in an ethical life, understand how our actions affect a large range of stakeholders, and understand the ethical obligations that a professional has to society. Now, am I going to reteach all these areas? No, I'm just going to draw some observations about these areas, because these are the core things that we've worked through, firstly through a structure of moral decision making, some models of ethics and morality. Then we've worked through a range of issues related to the external environment, the international environment, and the internal environment of the organisation, and how business ethics and corporate social responsibility relate to those things. So this is really much more focused on you and your professional career. And I suppose that one of the things about there's only one slide for Objective 5, because you and your professional career actually is throughout these objectives. So let's get started. I'm going to try to do this in one block today, so it'll be a little bit of a longer block than normal, but I may have to break it up depending on how it renders in the system. So here goes. Objective 1. Understand how self-interest can conflict with our moral obligations. We talked about that quite a lot earlier in the class. And earlier in the sessions, in the first 2 or 3 sessions, a lot of those issues were about the different forms of moral reasoning and how they related to our own self-interest. But later, when we were talking about the interests of organisations, and later when we were talking about the role of employees in the course, we also talked about self-interest. So, self-interest. For many employees, self-interest and moral obligation creates a conflict. For many employees, protecting themselves or safeguarding their jobs is the primary factor in determining whether their own interests or the interests of the others should be put before those of the firm. Moral theorists, however, say that society as a whole distinguishes between prudential reasons, those are the considerations of self-interest, and moral reasons, considerations of the moral interests of others. And we have to balance these moral obligations to others with our own self-interest, and it's particularly relevant when we're making ethical decisions, when we're making decisions that have some ethical component. It's possible for prudential and moral considerations to take us in different directions. Morality does not impose obligations on us without regard to their cost. Remember, in the second half of this lecture, we're going to review some of the key topic areas, and in the second half of the lecture, we're going to come back to the three different sets of moral perspectives: virtue, teleological, and deontological. So whether they have consequences or non-consequential moral reasoning. In situations in which consequences of a decision threaten one's livelihood or career, prudential concerns can properly be taken into account in deciding what one should do. However, when moral concerns are great, elementary morality, personal integrity require people to make substantial sacrifices to behave in a moral and ethical way. So we have to, when we're making these decisions in our professional lives, look at the reasons that are influencing us, or the factors that are influencing us to be drawn to self-interest or to potential influences on moral decision making. So an evaluation of those prudential issues is affected by our own temperament, our own confidence, our own attitudes, our own perception of risk. I mean, for example, we've all been experienced COVID-19, and many of you have suddenly had differences created in your casual or full-time jobs. Suddenly you're under a lot of different stresses about your life and your study, all of which will affect your temperament and affect how you analyse moral decisions externally. And it also affects your perceptions of self-interest, which in turn affects your evaluation of prudential reasons to make ethical decisions. Each of us has the potential to magnify, so I'll say that again correctly, each of us has the tendency to magnify potential threats to our livelihood and our career. So we're more likely to magnify threats. And in fact, there's some evidence that males are more likely to magnify potential threats than females, in part because of the underlying cultural ethos that males should be the breadwinner. I'm not saying it's the right cultural ethos, I'm just saying that comes out of the literature, comes out of the societal attitude. Exaggerating the cost to ourselves of acting otherwise makes it easier to rationalise away the damage we're doing to others. So evaluating or exaggerating the amount of impact a decision is likely to have on you means that it makes the issues related to the prudential issues less important. You can justify that they are less important. So we need to reflect on ourselves about what influences our perception and our temperament. Do we follow authority blindly? Do we suffer from moral tunnel vision on the job? Do we behave differently on the job than we would if we were dealing with the same issues in our broader life? Do we mindlessly do what is demanded of us, oblivious to the impact of our cooperation and actions on the outside parties? And have we given enough attention to our possible roles as accomplices in moral undoing of other individuals, businesses, social institutions? So, yes, now for a Donald Trump example, and I may post this video link. As you know, there's a lot of protests in America at the moment. Outside the White House, there was a peaceful protest. The Attorney General ordered, it would appear, military, police and other federal agencies to clear the area, and they used rubber bullets and they used flash bombs for a peaceful process, a peaceful protest that is legally protected. While at the same time, the President of the United States was saying that he was supporting peaceful processes and saying the only time this would be used was because of for thugs and dangerous situations, lawlessness, none of which existed in this particular protest. It was well documented that it was a peaceful protest, and it was well before the curfew, some half an hour before the curfew. It would appear that it was primarily to allow Donald Trump to walk from the White House to a church and hold up a Bible for a campaign and to show himself as a tough president. The military obviously had a military police, and the federal agencies are bound by both laws and requirements to follow those laws. Obviously, it was interpreted as a legal order. But was it a moral order? But then what would have been the consequences if any of those police, military police, or other federal agents, law-keeping agencies, like the Secret Service, for example, did not respond, did not do what they were told to by the President and the Attorney General? So we have a conflict of individual and moral and legislative environments, prudential and self-interest. Do we take a balanced view of our own interests versus those of others? Do we have substantial evidence for believing that our livelihoods are really threatened, or is it the belief based on more an exaggeration on the facts? Now, reflecting on what we've seen over the last 18 months in the US government, anybody who doesn't agree or anyone who seeks to constrain Donald Trump seems to lose their job and be pillarised. All the inspector generals have gone. Many people have been sacked. So possibly the perception is not exaggerated, but it is a reflection decision. Have we been imaginative in trying to balance our prudential and our moral concerns? Have we sought to find some middle ground? Or have we set up a false self-other dilemma in which our self-interests and the interests of others are erroneously seen as incompatible with each other? Is our collective self-interest, is our collective interest to protect societal well-being greater than our self-interest? So when prudential reasons are great, it is in our collective self-interest to protect societal well-being. But if we're not required to perform supererogatory actions, can society be protected from wrongdoing? So what we have at the moment, again, using the current situation in the US as an example, is many of the norms of how these issues of Black Lives Matter or violence by police leading to protests, leading to possibly riots, leading to looting, it's being treated in a way that does not seem to align with the normal way that is being dealt with in the past, which is to try to bring society together. It seems to be put in the position of trying to tear society apart. So we could argue that the people who are peacefully protesting are trying to protect society. Is society's well-being being left to a few heroic souls willing to perform those actions? And when employees have a clear duty to report unethical behaviour, so we're looking at a workplace situation, the personal risk involved may keep them from doing the right thing. Who protects society then? So those are our balance between self-interest and prudential interests. The second thing to talk about, and again, we've got some shorter slides now, some shorter sections. And I want to re-emphasise that we're going to come back and go through the key themes of the course in 11B and then next week in our review, exam preparation review. So as far as regulation is concerned, Legislation cannot guarantee that a business or a government acts ethically. Complying with the law and acting ethically are not always the same. The law is not always effective, and business has to take responsibility and hold itself to higher moral standards. Sometimes it is professional bodies that are holding the behaviour of the individuals in that profession to higher standards, and in some cases they end up being whistleblowers, or they end up influencing the way that business operates because of those standards. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in Objective 5. We talked during the course about the importance of ethical leadership and living an ethical life. Ethical leadership is essential, since ethics comes from the top in organisations, and leaders set the moral tone of organisations. Now again, looking at the current situation in the US, there are clearly people who are looting that may or may not have anything to do with what they are calling legitimate protest. But are we seeing moral leadership from the top of the organisation, which in this case is the government? Are we, the federal government, are we seeing moral leadership at state level? Are we seeing moral leadership related to the way the police forces have been acting and over-policing people in, particularly African American people, people of colour in the US? Ethical leadership is essential. Ethics comes from the top. Leaders need to set a moral tone. It is impossible for an organisation to attain a reputation for being ethical if its leaders do not set this tone, if the leaders are not seen as ethical. So how might what you've learnt be applied to your professional life? When you are in a leadership position, will you model ethical behaviour? Do you feel that you have the requisite skills to be able to make ethical decisions? And what are some of those skills that you will need? Those are the questions that you need to ask yourselves as you proceed in your career. Well, part of that is understanding the impact that our actions have on a range of stakeholders. And part of that is just understanding that living an ethical life gives us challenges as future managers about how we should reflect on our professional obligations, which is Objective 4 and Objective 5. But as I said all the way through, this whole lecture is focused on the relationship between your future professional career and the broader issues of morality and ethics and business ethics and corporate social responsibility that we've discussed during the course. There are limits to what a law can be expected to achieve. The law can be too cumbersome a tool to legislate effectively and to respond to the problems in a timely manner. And our political system gives corporations and their advocates significant input into writing laws and significant input often to how those laws are implemented. The judicial process is often too blunt an instrument to use in the way that manages complex social and business issues. And legal action may simply make corporations more secretive. It breeds distrust. They may destroy documents. It may create an environment where the corporation says, well, we're going to be sued in any case, so we won't do anything more than we are absolutely legally required to do. Any more than we are absolutely legally required to do. Now, let me give you an example of that may in fact be affecting some of you at the moment. In South Australia and Victoria, there are changes to eviction regulations and changes to the way that payments of rent can be negotiated. In South Australia, it is a requirement that the landlord or the property manager sends to all people on the rental contract, actually may in fact just say the main contact, and all landlords, so the property manager is supposed to send it to the landlord, not only the broad issue of how they will be managing requests to reduce rent during COVID-19 or what information they'll be requiring, but also the detailed process as an attachment from the rental bonds section of, I think it's the Department of Consumer Affairs in South Australia, from the rental bonds section of the Department of Consumer Affairs. Here it's the Department of Justice. So you get this really detailed, really clear way, couched in terms of, here's the minimum legal requirements, but here's the reason we're doing it and the expectations. You're getting a greater level of consultation between the landlord and the individual, but also it provides the information to the landlord and the tenant about what evidence is seen as acceptable for the request to have your rent reduced. So what income evidence there is, and it specifies it. And it specifies it in broad enough terms to give multiple ways that this could be done, all of which are clearly legal. In Victoria, no such attached document is provided unless particular landlords, particular property managers may be doing it, but generally not. So I've seen things that are clearly illegal being sent to tenants, asking for information that goes well beyond what they're allowed to do under the Credit Provision Acts or Federal Acts or the Victorian Privacy Act, and stating it in a way that says, unless you achieve everything, you cannot request a rental reduction. Well, there's no legal restriction of you requesting a rental reduction. But beyond that, there's also some clever landlords that are writing it in such efficient legalese that they are meeting the absolute minimum legal requirement. Property managers rather than landlords. The absolute minimum legal requirement. So pushing it into a situation where it will be a conflict situation, where it'll have to go to within the Department of Justice, the Rental Tenancies Board, which will take 3 or 4 months because of the backlog. And that backlog's there, not because because of the increased demand. Not because of anything the state government's doing, but because of the increased demand. Now, I'm not going to get political about why the legislation isn't the same in the two states, but arguably it comes to the who controls the government lower house and who controls the upper house in Victoria. But that change means that landlords can absolutely only giving the information they're absolutely legally required to do, but the nature of the information is different and better in one state. But it also leaves this legalese loophole, particularly in Victoria, where you can appear to be giving legal advice and you are complying with the law, but in fact, you're not. Do we want a system in which business people believe their only obligation is to obey the law? Or do we want a societal system, where it's morally permissible for them to do more when they're expected to do more? And folding back to what we've talked about in the course of our organisational performance, most organisations who behave in a corporately responsible way outperform those who don't in the longer term and normally in the shorter term. Short to medium term. Responsible and ethical behaviour requires that corporations and people within them hold high moral standards and that they themselves monitor their own behaviour. So, we've sort of talked about Objective 5 as we've gone along, that we have legal, ethical obligations as professionals to behave in a way that complies with the professional ethics of our organisation. But even if we're not in a prescribed profession, and then I shouldn't say prescribed because things like HR and accounting aren't actually prescribed professions. Even if we're not in a profession that's like a medical profession, a teaching profession that have particular prescriptions, the Institute of Management, the Australian Human Resource Institute, all the accounting organisations, and you're not required to be a member of one of the accounting organisations to be an accountant in Australia. You might have to be for particular migration reasons. But all those codes of ethics are designed to make or assist people in behaving in an ethical way so they influence the behaviour of business and society to improve the corporate social responsibility and legal compliance of the organisation. The final point I want to make before we just do a quick review, quick summary, is that living an ethical life presents us with challenges. And as future managers, you should start reflecting upon what your professional obligations are. What are your prudential pressures? What is your self-interest? And are you evaluating them correctly? So in Section A, what have we done? We've talked about, I'm sorry, there seems to be a little dot point error there, but we talked about how we understand self-interest and how it can conflict with our moral obligations. We've talked about the role and limitation of regulation in affecting ethical behaviour. We've talked about how we understand the benefits of ethical leadership and living an ethical life. We've talked about how we understand our actions and how that affects a range of stakeholders. And we've also talked about our ethical obligations as a professional. If you are doing the accounting stream, you should go and look at your preferred professional body, whether it's IPA or CPA or chartered, that you aspire to, and look at what their ethical code of conduct is. If you are doing management, or you're actually doing management, you're interested in, say, human resource management, you should go and look at the Australian Human Resource Institute or the Australian Institute of Management websites to look at what the ethical obligations of those two organisations are, the code of conduct. If you are considering marketing as a career, or you're already in marketing as a career, in fact, if you're already in any of these things as a career, but for the marketing people, look at the Australian Marketing Institute Code of Conduct. And just reflect on what the expectations of those codes of conduct are. Now, that's not examinable. That's just one way that you can develop and reflect on your professional career and your future professional obligations. Okay, so that's the end of 11A. There'll be a separate coverage of 11B, which is our review of the course and what the exam expectations are. And again, I'll remind you that next week's session, 3-hour Zoom session, drop-in Zoom session, it's not compulsory, but we'll be looking in that revision session. There'll be some multiple choice question examples and also some practice exam questions in that session to work on. And that will be run in Zoom.